Bankruptcy has been a pretty hot topic recently. A lot of conversations we've been hearing have been from the perspective of the debtor and not necessarily the creditor. What's your take on the uptick in maritime related bankruptcies?
Well, clearly, the uptick in maritime bankruptcies is directly a result of what's happening in the market. The fact that that cash cushions that companies had going into this cycle have drained. The cycle's lasted so long that it means naturally that there's going to be more and more companies who are too tight. They can't make their debt service payments and their operating payments. Once you can't meet debt service and can't make OPEX, you need some relief somehow. What are you going to do? You can't find any new credit in this market. It's either dissolve, liquidate, or find some protective court. I think a number of people are looking at the United States, the possibility of Chapter 11, the relief that it immediately gives debtors when they file, the opportunity it gives company management to get their house in order and see if there's something to salvage. From a creditor's perspective, they can get very worried. They've seen the recent cases in the jurisdictional matters, Marco Polo Sea Trade, Omega, where the bankruptcy courts have demonstrated how wide a reach their orders can have, how little is really needed to get the jurisdiction of a bankruptcy court to invoke the protections of the automatic stay, etc. And I think that's given a lot of people pause. Debtors will use it in discussions with their lenders as a sword and a shield. They can tell if they're running into difficulties negotiating with the lenders on a restructuring, or even if they're just trying to kick the can down the road, they're going to say, look, guys, you come after us, we're going to file for Chapter 11. Or, in at least one case I know of, Chapter 7. Now, what does that mean to the debtor? First, to the creditors. First off, let me say to you that I think creditors, especially those that are not accustomed to U.S. legal regimes and not accustomed to bankruptcy, have an exaggerated fear of Chapter 11 that they do not need to have. I think, as you know, Aaron, I'm talking tomorrow in the legal breakout session of the conference on bankruptcy, the winners, the losers, and the collateral damage. I hope it's a catchy topic, a catchy subject. Obviously, I don't want to sound too cavalier about it. I'm not so sure there are easily recognizable winners and losers in a bankruptcy, but I think too many creditors at least, go into bankruptcy thinking they're going to lose. And I'm suggesting that that's not always going to be the case. I don't think bankruptcy is necessarily the right thing for shipping companies for a lot of reasons. The automatic stay is not going to necessarily reach that port agent in some far-flung port who you need relief from perhaps too with a claim. And bankruptcy costs a lot of money. In that sense, it may be better for the debtor than the creditors, because your collateral pool necessarily shrinking when the money is being dissipated by the payment of professional fees. Being a professional, I suppose that's not all bad, if I can be a little humorous about it. But I do think that people look at the Chapter 11 process sometimes in a way that they don't need to. I was in Hamburg, Germany about a month ago, meeting with a client over there, and one of the first questions they asked me was, how do I make sure that I'm never involved in a Chapter 11 as a creditor? My answer to them was, you can never assure. Marco Polo Sea Trade has demonstrated to you, to anything, you can never be assured that you're not going to be in a Chapter 11. But don't greet it with fear. Chapter 11 can sometimes bring order to a process that might otherwise be very chaotic. It's a lot easier if people are forced to be in the same room together to discuss a debtor's survival or a divvying up of its assets. Without the protection that the Chapter 11 gives and the order that it can bring to a negotiating process, who knows what takes over, what forces take over, what small creditor could end up being the tail wagging the dog. So my first advice to them was, think about it. It's not always a bad thing, not necessarily a good thing, but it can be better than if you're just trying to pick the bones in many different places around the world. But I don't think a lot of the press recently has paid much attention to the creditor side of the equation. Everybody talks about the companies going into bankruptcy, the protections it gives to them. I deliberately chose that topic. I mentioned on my paper, my presentation tomorrow, because I do think there's some people do win in the process. Some people will tell you, I suppose cynically, that it's company management that can end up winning, but that's not the side I'm looking at it from. I'm looking at it from the creditors. I think secured creditors, I think banks at the end of the day come out well, or can come out well in the bankruptcy process if it's not prolonged, the process. I think unsecured creditors, that's a different answer. I think they're in a much more difficult position than secured creditors are. And in a lot of the public shipping companies today, the bigger shipping companies, capital structures are more complicated than they used to be. There now is typically a class of creditors that is unsecured, maybe bondholders or a mezzanine debt provider. My own personal thesis, and I won't claim to be the world's biggest expert on bankruptcy, but my own personal thesis that in bankruptcy, in order for it to be effective, in order for it to provide a solution to a debtor, you need to have a class of capital that you can squeeze. Unsecured creditors, bondholders, mezzanine debt holders, they're that class of capital that gets squeezed in a bankruptcy. If you can keep the senior debt happy, and you can keep management going, is a chance you're going to be able to survive, notwithstanding what may happen to unsecured creditors along the way.
Are you an advocate for the so-called prepackaged bankruptcy, where the parties meet and try to come up with a package before they file?
Yes, I am. To the extent your choices are prepackaged bankruptcy and the free-for-all that you might have outside of bankruptcy, or the prolonged process you'll have within bankruptcy. I'd already alluded to the expense of a bankruptcy proceeding. You can eliminate a lot of that expense or reduce that expense in a prepackaged bankruptcy. If it can work for GM, maybe it can work for TBS. And I do think in the absence of a bankruptcy process, you do run the risk of chaos. So yes, if you can get creditors together beforehand, at least the major creditors, those that are going to be impacted the most, those that are going to have the biggest votes on any plan of reorganization, and can get it done in a prepackaged process, I think that's advantageous to everyone. Somebody's going to lose in a bankruptcy process no matter what. Somebody's going to lose in a liquidation process no matter what. If you're an unsecured claimant and there's not enough cash there, you're not going to get paid.
A lot of people at this conference would argue the shipping bankruptcies that we've seen recently didn't come as much of a surprise. Do you expect to see any surprises out there in the coming years?
Well, I have to be very careful. When I start talking about predicting the future, lawyers are never very good at that. We're much better at analyzing the past, or perhaps guiding our clients to prepare for the future. I don't think that we've seen the end of the bankruptcies in this cycle. Do I think there are going to be any surprises? No. The reason I don't think there are going to be any surprises is now we've seen enough people have looked at TBS, they've looked at Genmar, they looked at Marco Polo Seatrade, they've looked at Omega. They know the process is there. It's now become familiar to all. Everybody recognizes it has a role, like it or not, in the winding down or restructuring of shipping companies. And we all know why those companies ended up in bankruptcy. You have a prolonged down cycle, companies run out of cash, and their only opportunity is to be able to find one or more classes of creditors that they can say, I'm not paying you now, or I'm not paying you, period. So if you look at balance sheets, if you look at cash burn rates of those companies, at least those that are public, you're going to be able to figure out who's next.